Okay, in this video, I am going to show you how to get started with Adobe After Effects. After Effects is the software that helped me to fall in love with the process of creating animated projects. I really love After Effects. I think it's an incredible tool for storytellers, and I think it's a shame that more people don't use it. It can be a little intimidating, but at its core, it doesn't have to be complicated. You can use it to do very simple things without having to go down the rabbit hole. Because the truth is, nobody knows the full extent of everything After Effects is capable of, because the power of After Effects comes from your own creative approach to the tool. So it really can do anything. It just requires your own creative interpretation. So let's get started. So I opened up After Effects. I'm using the latest version here. This is the screen whenever you get started here. And let's go ahead and create a new project. And this is the default screen inside of After Effects. So if you're familiar with Adobe Premiere, the workflow in After Effects is somewhat similar. After Effects is like somewhere between Premiere and Photoshop. And essentially, After Effects is, at its core, a compositing program, which is to say it's a program designed for you to take objects, blend them together, put in effects, movements, things like that, and then take them into a video editing application to create your final result. So After Effects is kind of a tool to make your shots look great and to combine everything together. And that can be footage like green screen or images like we're going to work with from Midjourney. But it also could just be like 3D models and things like that from tools like Cinema 4D all the way to rendered out depth maps and things like that we'll get to later on in the modules. So inside of After Effects, just like in Premiere Pro, you have your project panel. So this is your project panel, and to import assets in the project panel, you can just double click or hit Command-I. And we'll go in and download the assets for this lesson. So I have 2 image assets here. I haven't up-res them. Again, if you're wanting to create something professional that you export and, share with the world, you want to export it over either 4K format or even bigger than 4K. For now, I will just use the resolution from Midjourney here. So essentially what we have at any time in After Effects, you can just double-click to kind of preview what the asset looks like. So we have these TIE fighters, basically, that I cut out using actually Canva. I didn't even use Photoshop because Canva was just super quick for this one. And we have a hanger basically with the background removed or with the TIE fighter in the middle removed. So I'm going to use this as our example just as we learn After Effects here. So right now we are just previewing this footage. You can see it says footage right here. You can't do anything with this. If this was a video clip, we could watch it back, but you can't like add effects or anything to this. This is just kind of a preview in the same way that we have a preview monitor inside of Adobe Premiere Pro. But to create a new composition, which is essentially like a sequence in Adobe Premiere, you can go to Composition, New Composition, or you can take an asset and drag it onto this kind of film reel icon here, and it'll create a new composition. And based on your defaults, it may change like the duration of the composition or the frame rate. Right now, if we go to Composition and Composition Settings, and just about everything you do, I should note, has a keyboard shortcut. So, for example, I can hit Command-K to to open up the Composition Settings panel, or I could hit Command-N to create a new composition. So just about everything can be programmed to a keyboard shortcut inside After Effects. So there's a lot of things you can look at here, but the biggest thing is the width is 1920, height is 1080. That's just an HD image, essentially. The frame rate is 24 frames per second, which is the cinematic frame rate of 24. Resolution's full. I don't know why you'd want less than full resolution. And then the duration. So we have first on the right, we have frames, seconds, minutes, and hours. So this is a 10-second composition. And the background color can be black. That's totally fine. Basically, if I turn off the background here, you can see. Or if I turn off the eyedropper on the left here, you can see that we have the black background. And if you ever want to see those transparent checker boxes, you can hit this button right here. Shows you the transparency. So that doesn't apply because this image doesn't have any transparent edges. And actually, you know what? I lied because for some reason, I don't know why, this image has like 1 pixel on the edge that is a little transparent, which is weird. But that's okay. We'll leave it like that for now, and then we'll fix it at the very end of the process. So when you're inside of After Effects, the area that you're going to spend the most amount of time is the transform properties, which basically affect any transformations related to the movement of your image. So for example, if I click this drop down arrow here, I can click the drop down again. We have the transform assets here. So if you are familiar with Adobe Premiere Pro, these are the basic transformations that you can adjust in the effects controls panel. Essentially, you can adjust the anchor point, which is the point in which all of the transformations happen around. So it's this like middle kind of crosshair here in the middle. We can adjust the position, which moves the position of the image. You can adjust the scale. You see we're scaling up from the anchor point here. So you can scale up, you can scale down, and then if you deselect the chain link, you can scale just the X or scale just the Y. Go ahead and keep that selected. You can also adjust the rotation, just like that, and the opacity. So you turn opacity all the way off and all the way on. So it may sound weird, but 80% of your time is going to be spent adjusting one of these settings here. So now what I want to do is bring in a TIE fighter image. So I have the rough cutout here. So if I turn off the eyedropper, you can see that we have all 3 TIE fighters here, but the problem is our background has 2 of the TIE fighters. So I actually want to cut out the middle one to where the other 2 are not visible. So I'm going to turn off the eyeball for the bottom one so I can just see what's going on here. And you can go up here. So there's some different options here. You can select the pen tool or the rectangle tool. And again, if you hold down, you can get other options here. I'm going to do the pen tool because I have a little bit more customization. And I'm going to essentially just cut this part out of the frame. So you just click and drag, and it creates these little arms that can kind of make these elliptical edges. And we're just going to cut out this TIE fighter, just like that. So there you go. And by default, it will keep everything inside of your frame. Hypothetically, like let's say we wanted everything outside of the mask here. Well, that's no problem. If we go to the drop-down menu, as soon as you make a mask, it'll create this mask menu here. And you can change the mode. So right now it's add. So it's basically everything inside the mask gets added. But we can say we want everything inside the mask to be subtracted. Just like that. So everything is now removed. And we can create a new mask and cut out other parts of the scene. Like let's say we just want to cut out just this top part of this wing here. We can, as long as we have our layer selected, we can cut out this. And you'll notice that nothing happened because it's set to add. And these are already basically adding because this is subtracting, so everything else gets added. So what I'm going to do is change this to subtract, just like that. Cool. And you can also invert these transfer modes as well here. So I'm going to change that. And now, because I inverted it, the subtracted only keeps the wing there. So my biggest recommendation would just be to play around with the mask here. You can get as deep as you want. There's some other options here. For example, like I can feather the edges. If I wanted to soften up the mask, which can be helpful for compositing, I can expand or contract the mask, which can be helpful. And then we can turn down the opacity as well if we so chose to do so. Okay, so now we have our isolated TIE fighter here. Let's make him move. So what I want to do is I want to adjust the transform properties. But the problem is, and I'm going to go ahead and click spacebar here. Right now, we're watching our composition and nothing is moving. And if I move the position, for example, on this TIE fighter, well, he's still not moving. We basically need to tell After Effects where, at what point in time, we want the TIE fighter to be in what position. So that's actually super easy to do. So for example, let's say that we want there to be the TIE fighter to be on the ground, and then at the 1 second mark, we want it to move up for 2 seconds so that 1 second it starts moving, 3 seconds it's done moving, and then let's say that it just scales up and like flies out of the frame. Cool. So I'm going to say that when the TIE fighter is off the ground and in his final position, I want him to be here. So I'm going to set a keyframe for the position. And I'll set a keyframe for the scale as well. So we're basically saying at this point in time, this TIE fighter needs to be in this position with this scale. And I'm going to go over here to the 1 second mark. And I'm going to move him down. You could use the levers here to just move him up and down. Or you can literally just, as long as you have your selection tool selected, you can move him down into position here. Just like that. So now if we play this back, you can hit the space bar. TIE fighter moves up. Sweet. So let's take this further. So I want the TIE fighter to move up, and then let's say we want him to also move towards the camera a little bit. Well, we can simulate that by using scale. Hypothetically, if we move forward here, I'm going to move forward 2 more seconds and scale it up. It looks like he's coming at the camera, right? I don't want to go that dramatic because you start losing quality. And so at any point here, and especially because this is a 1920 by 1080 format, we don't want the assets to begin to lose quality. So if I was working on this project in a professional context, I would introduce more resolution. I'd up-res this image. Let's say that our final resolution was going to be 4K. My composition would be at least 6K so that I have plenty of resolution to work with, and this can scale up without creating pixelation when we export it in the 4K format. But for our example, I will allow it to go beyond the native resolutions, and it will get a little pixelated, so you've been warned. So I scaled it up and I've moved it forward. So now we see we have our TIE fighter moves up and then he moves forward just like that. Cool. So it looks like he's kind of coming to the camera, and we can also change the rotation too if we wanted to. So we can go to rotation here and change the rotation of the TIE fighter. Pretty cool. I think that if we decided we wanted to change the rotation, I would have preferred for the anchor point to be right in the middle of the cockpit here. It's too late now that we have set the keyframes here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you real quick how quickly you can do this. So I'll deselect, and using this tool here, this pan behind anchor tool with Y, you move the anchor point to right dead center of this cockpit. So now we can do all those same movements. I'm just going to set a keyframe for position and scale, move forward to 3 seconds, move it up here. And if you ever want to set a keyframe without adjusting one of these settings here, you can just hit this diamond to set a keyframe. So scale still at 100, move forward to 5 seconds. Scale up, and then move it up just a little bit. And then now what we can do is set a keyframe for the rotation. And we'll have him rotate just a little bit. Just like that. So it goes up, and then he starts to rotate. Cool. So that's keyframes, and keyframes can be used in just about anything inside of After Effects. You can keyframe mask, you can keyframe effects. Just essentially, if you can adjust something, there's a really good chance that you can use a keyframe to set that item's position and value in time. And so it just is a very helpful way to adjust things. So the next thing I want to talk about, so you'll see that this movement feels very, very stiff and unnatural. If we play this back, goes up, hard hit, and then he moves forward. That's not how life works. If you look at movements in life, they're always a little more organic. They always kind of ease in and ease out. And one of the fastest ways to add an ease in After Effects, if you select your keyframes, you can right-click, go to Keyframe Assistant, and you can do Easy Ease. And this basically will smooth out that movement a little bit. So let me go plink this back here. You can see that the movement is much more smooth. And we can do the same thing for scale here. Right-click on those keyframes, go to Keyframe Assistant, and then Easy Ease. So now we have some keyframes that are much more smooth. Then you can see it just feels a little more natural. And we'll do the same thing with the rotation. Let's take a look at this. Great. That seems a lot more natural. And I want to take it one step further. Now, this is a little advanced, but I really think it's important to learn this concept early, because this tip that I'm about to show you is the difference between an amateur compositor inside of After Effects and a professional one. And that is understanding the speed and value graph. So if I select a keyframe, we'll stick with position for now. And I click on this graph editor here. You can see that we have a visual representation, and it looks like an algebra equation, but don't worry, it's not that scary. Essentially, this is a representation of the amount of movement. And because we added in these ease keyframes, you can see that the movement is pretty low, and then the movement is faster, and then it goes back to low, and then it moves faster, back to low. So what we can do from this graph is actually adjust the amount of movement and how organic it is. So right now we are in what's called the value graph. And you can see that it has an X position and a Y position, and it's smooth. And essentially this looks a heck of a lot like an algebra graph, if you think back to middle school here. But I actually like working in the speed graph better, because I think it gives me a little bit more of a better indication of the movements. And you can see that we have this keyframe here, it's set, and then we have this arm. And if I adjust this arm, it's going to adjust the arc. And essentially, whenever you are working inside of After Effects, you want to have the arcs typically create these mountain peaks with these kind of soft valleys. And this is an animation concept. It's super old. Like the classic Disney animators learned this concept. But basically, you always want there to be like these smooth ramping movements. It just makes things feel more lifelike. And I will say, if at any point, like if you didn't have an easy ease keyframe and you came into the speed or graph editor without, you can hold down Option and click on the keyframe, and it'll allow you to adjust these little arms like this. So I'm going to select this one over here as well, and I'll adjust it and smooth it out. So take a look at the position, not the scale. So just the position of the TIE fighter here. You can see it'll be a lot more smooth. Great. So you can see it moves up way more organically, and then it scales up and kind of moves out from there. So I think this looks a lot more natural. And it moves forward towards the camera. So let's adjust the scale now. I'll select the scale keyframe, go to the speed graph here. And we're inside the speed graph editor. I don't need to change that. And we can just have it slowly scale up. So, just assuming that the ship is like powering up, and then it hits full intensity before like coming to the screen. So in this instance, I want it to like be at its fastest right here. And we'll just assume that like the camera's going to cut right when that happens. So let's go ahead and watch this back. So it moves up. Cool. And it moves towards the camera. And we can adjust all these things. Like sometimes when you're in the graph editor and you change something, you may realize like, oh, actually, I think I want the keyframes to be closer to really drive home the point. Cool. Looks good. And again, it's kind of a back and forth process. Adjusting the scale there, I may decide like, oh, actually, I want the position of the movement to be higher like that. And we actually may want it, so I can select both these keyframes and go to the graph editor. And now we can see both of them represented on the graph. And so maybe the position, we want it to have a similar curve type as the scale so that it matches the movement, so that it wasn't like dipping. Did you see it kind of dipping in that previous shot? So now we can play it back. And it's just coming right for the camera. And we can just do very quickly, same thing with rotation, just like that. And maybe with rotation, we can do the same thing, just a movement that looks like that. I think that looks pretty cool as an example. So next thing I want to talk about is hitting the save button. So Command S is going to be your best friend. Make sure that you are always saving. It's something that is probably going to become second nature to you. Just hit, after you do anything important in After Effects, hit Command S, because you never know when your computer crashes and then you have to go back and redo your work. There's also a setting inside of After Effects. If you go to After Effects here and go to Settings, and then there is the autosave setting here. You can adjust the amount of autosaves that it saves to your computer. And this is really important because you don't want your overall project to crash and you lose a bunch of your progress. So the default is 20 minutes. So basically, you're saying that if my project crashes, I may lose up to 20 minutes of work. That's terrible. I recommend it. Probably about 5 minutes. You probably don't want to lose it more than 5 minutes on your project. Okay, so let's say we want to add in some text here. We can do that no problem. There's a text tool, and you can just click in your frame and just type in your text. Say, Star Wars rules. And always go back to your selection tool. You just like move this text around. I'll just put this in the middle here. Maybe on this tile, like right in the middle. And there's a really cool feature. If you go to the grid here, you can go to proportional grid, and you can see the exact center where the frame is. We turn that off. Cool. And you can see that the text right now is like this weird gray. So let's select something different. You just go to the text window that pops up here, and we'll select just some color from the frame here. Maybe this like magenta color. Cool. And just like everything else, you can adjust just about anything here. So you can adjust the text spacing, you can adjust the stroke, the paragraph options. Really everything is present here. There's also a text animator, so you can animate the actual parameters of the text. So for example, let me just show you a couple things here. So we can adjust, if I go to the animate drop-down menu here, and let's just say the opacity of each layer. So I'm going to turn down this range, this opacity to 0, and the text goes away. But if we actually change the offset, you can see that it reveals the text essentially. So that's pretty cool. And so we can turn that to 0, and I'm going to change the start now. So if we go and change the end value to like 100% and then change the start value, we can basically reveal the text one letter at a time. And of course we could set a keyframe. So let's set a keyframe at the beginning, move forward to the 3-second mark, and then all the text pops on. Star Wars rules. Oh, isn't that beautifully cinematic? And you can also, in the advanced options here, I'm not going to get into all of these, but you can change the value from being based on characters, and we'll change it to words. So now it animates just the words on individually. Just like that. Star Wars rules. Yes, it does. Okay, cool. So that's how to edit text. Now I want to talk to you about something that we will get into that's related to some more advanced movements and things like that. So right now we're working in a 2D environment, which means basically all these assets are behaving like paper. There's no depth to them. They're basically just flat. But After Effects actually can support 3D depth. And to see 3D objects inside of After Effects, you need to hit this toggle switches button. And that turns on a secondary menu. You see there's just different options here in the secondary menu. And in here, you'll see this 3D, this kind of cube. And if we select that, it will actually turn our assets into 3D objects. So for example, our text here, we now have this like 3D kind of wheel option, and it has like all these little buttons and gizmos that we can select. And I can move it forward and back in 3D space. Isn't that cool? We can rotate it. We can do all sorts of things. Now, the other issue is because our actual image is in 3D space too, let me show you. Because our image is in 3D space, if we push back this text, you can't actually see it, right? So that's a problem. So we want the text basically to only come forward, because if we push it back, it will get lost. So you can go to your transform options here, and then you can adjust the position. And in negative space means that it's coming closer to the camera, and we can move around and do all that good stuff. So again, you could set keyframes for objects in 3D environments in same way you would with 2D, and move things just throughout the scene that way. So the next thing I want to do is talk to you about those 3D movements. So right now, I'm gonna go ahead and delete this Star Wars rules text. So right now, we simulated this object moving up and coming to the screen. But what if we actually wanted it to move in actual 3D space? That would be pretty cool. So I'm going to select our TIE fighter now, and I am going to turn off the keyframes. And because we now have him in the 3D, I'm going to set a position keyframe and a rotation keyframe. I'm not going to set a keyframe per scale. So we'll move these keyframes to the 1 second mark, just like we had before. And again, we'll move forward to the 3 second mark. I'll move him up. And right now, he's just moving on a singular plane, right? We turn this sideways. And I'm hitting C to go to the orbit tool here just to see what's going on. So we went ahead and moved him up. So now we want him to move closer to the camera. I'll move to the 5 second mark, and we will select the position, and I'll literally move him closer to the camera. So now he's coming right at us, right? So we also have this issue here where the TIE fighter, for whatever reason, is just dipping behind the background. It's mainly because there's like a keyframe interpolation issue, but to fix that, we can just click P for position on the background, and we'll just push the background behind, and then you can hit S for scale, and just scale him up to where he fills up the frame there. So now the TIE fighter moves up, and now he's moving at the camera. Cool. So right now we are in a classic After Effects panel. There's not like an actual camera. We're just like a composition looking at this scene. But you can actually create cameras inside of After Effects, which is super helpful for cinematography. So let's go ahead and try that out. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Camera to create a camera, and we'll set all these. We'll let all these things be default here, and I'm going to have a 50mm camera, and by default, the After Effects composition window is 50mm, so it should give you the exact same result when you click Go. And it did. So right now, our camera, let me turn off our camera here. I'm going to, we'll take a top view here. So it's a little weird and to conceptualize here, but essentially here's what we have. This is where our camera is positioned. This is our TIE fighter asset, and this is the background. So the camera sees the background image and the TIE fighter, and the TIE fighter, essentially if we scrub through here, you can see that it moves closer to the camera to simulate that depth. Just as if there was a real TIE fighter in this scene, it's kind of moving towards the camera. But change this back to the active camera. So cameras are interesting for many different reasons. You know, for example, if we wanted to create like a moving shot here, we can go to our camera options and we can actually change the zoom. So we can like zoom in on our scene and it's going to make it much more realistic, like the zoom feels like a real camera. And the other thing you can do is depth of field. So depth of field is interesting because you can actually simulate like a rack focus and a shot that feels like it was realistically shot on a cinematic camera. So let's just kind of play around with this for just a second. You can get really deep with it. Let's look at the keyframes here. So essentially, the TIE fighter is at the same depth here, and then he moves closer to the camera. So what I want to do is I want the focus to stay on the TIE fighter and for it to get a little out of focus as the background should get out of focus as the TIE fighter comes closer to the camera. So let's try that out. Let's go over here and we turned on the depth of field. And by default, you're probably not going to see a lot of changes whenever you turn on the depth of field. But what you can do is you can crank the blur level up a lot just to begin to see kind of where the depth is. So now I want the camera to link to the TIE fighter. I want us to only have that center TIE fighter be in focus while this composition is progressing. So to do that, what we can do is select the TIE fighter and select the camera. I'm going to right click on the TIE fighter, go to camera, and then link focus distance to layer. So now you can see this focus distance turn red and essentially just added in some code. You don't have to worry about what the code means, but essentially our focus is now entirely going to be on that middle TIE fighter and he'll be in focus the entire time. So now the blur, you can see it's way too over the top. That is completely unnatural and unrealistic. So I'm going to turn this down to where it feels right. So the good rule of thumb in After Effects is to keep things really subtle. I'll keep it about there. So that's 285%. Maybe even less, maybe about 180. So the TIE fighter comes closer to the camera and then sits down. And then I don't think I want there to be any blur as he's rising because this hypothetically is on the same focal plane, this TIE fighter and these TIE fighters. They should all be in focus the same way. So I'll actually, I want to keyframe the blur level for that part. This keyframe over. It's there. And I'll keyframe the blur level to be 0 there. So now everything's super sharp and in focus. And then as he moves closer, things become out of focus. Turn it up here. You can see as he gets closer to the camera, things become out of focus. And maybe we want things to be a little more out of focus. Just a little bit more there. Sweet. So TIE fighter moves up. And he comes to the camera. Awesome. Okay, great. So the next thing I want to talk about is a concept called pre-composing. So you can actually put compositions inside other compositions. So pre-composing is really important for a number of different reasons. Basically, it allows you to edit certain things without destroying your final composition. So for example, if I was to go in here and let me just delete our camera. We don't need it anymore. Let me just pre-compose, for example, just this TIE fighter here. Shift Command C, or you can go to Layer, Pre-compose. And I almost always move all the attributes to a new composition. So essentially, we now have a composition inside of our bigger composition here. And I can turn that composition on and off. I can drag that TIE fighter composition in here. So now we have two of the same composition doing the exact same thing. And we could get real crazy with it. So it's pretty cool because if I wanted to, I could just go to our pen tool and let's say I just like want to cut out certain parts of this TIE fighter. Maybe I just want to adjust this like this. And I don't know. Yeah, it's exactly what I want. I can go back for original and it will adjust it. So any changes made inside of this composition get reflected in this composition. So it's pretty cool. It's a very helpful tool to use. We're going to use it a lot. That's probably the most complex thing that you're going to learn. But essentially, it's just a composition inside of another composition. And it's very similar to like smart objects inside of Photoshop. And the last thing that I want to talk about is effects. So there's an effects browser over here on the right, and there's a ton of effects inside of After Effects. I don't have time to get into all of them, but they all do different things. One of the ones I use a lot is the camera blur. So there's a camera lens blur. I'm just going to apply it to this TIE fighter here, and I'll just turn up the blur radius here. You can see that that TIE fighter is becoming out of focus. But the cool thing about this blur is if you look at the way it's operating here around the highlights, it's turning these highlights into ovals in a very similar way to an actual camera if something was out of focus. So that's a very powerful blur to use versus there's some of the other blurs like fast blurs and things like that, but they're not quite as realistic. There's also some really powerful color tools that I use quite a lot. So if you're familiar with using Photoshop or Adobe Premiere, there's like things like a levels effect that you can adjust like the levels, and you can get real nitty gritty with like changing the value. Like I can change the value for only the red channel or only the green channel. It's pretty cool. There's a curves adjustment. Again, yeah, you can adjust it like you would curves in any other editing application. And you can also do things like tints, which is important if you were just like want to throw on a black and white tint, or maybe you didn't want the blacks to be black. You actually want them to be like a deeper blue. You have that option. So there's a lot of really helpful effects. I'll cover some of the more essential ones that we need to cover in this course as it relates to cinematography, but really you could spend a month playing around with a lot of the effects in here.